Welcome to 100 Artifacts for 100 Years, the Paterson Museum Centennial exhibition. And we are doing part one, which is where we will be discussing the first 20 artifacts that were selected as a part of this exhibit. The exhibit, we should say, for those who haven't physically seen the exhibit in the museum, the exhibit, we selected 100 artifacts to represent the 100 years of our existence as an organization. And each of the artifacts has a special part of the museum's story. So they're not necessarily the most exciting artifacts if you were going to ask us to pick the most important for the history of Paterson. Some of them are just very important to us here at the museum.
And they're in the order that you'll find them throughout the museum, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well, let's begin. The anniversary of the museum starts with our founding, of course, back in February 9th, 1925. You can learn all about the whole history of the museum. We have a separate YouTube presentation that's already ready to go for you. Anyway, the real parent of the museum is the Paterson Free Public Library, which is the first free public library in the state of New Jersey. And on the left, you see the building, the Danforth Memorial, which was erected in 1903, and it opened to the public in April of 1905. When they opened, they started with public exhibit of drawings by Charles Scribner, book illustrations, and it attracted over 10,000 people within the first 3 months. Of course, that was also part of, the new library once it was reopened after the Great Fire had wiped out the original Danforth Memorial Library. Little by little, they started collecting, and in 1917, Thomas Hallahan, who was an electrical engineer on the Panama Canal, with permission through General Goethals, he started doing studies of the floral and fauna, as well as the birds and other species there, and documenting them, as well as he started collecting in a scientific manner. And he had approached the Board of Library Trustees if he could present these, and this is what you see in the assembly room. So really, our very first exhibits start 1917 as the library. And again, this is at the insistence of George Winchester, the real first long-term director of the library. And after they did a few exhibits, they ended up in storage for about, a couple of years before they decided we need to get these regularly displayed. And they had hired James Morton as our very first curator, also in 1925. The same time, they created the Standing Museum Committee, which is the same committee that governs the operations of the museum to this day. After the introduction at the assembly room, they started right away looking for our very first space. And right adjacent to the library was the former coach house of Mayor Nathan Barnard. Next slide. There you go. That's her back in the 1970s after it was retrofitted to become a museum. Actually, where the parking lot is where the former Barnard Mansion was. Interesting, in 1928-29, they had offered that building to be the home of the Passaic County Historical Society, but they did not accept that, and eventually the building was razed. At the same time, we get the building in the back, and that would remain the home of the Paterson Museum from 1927 to 1981. Rather small, it's about 3,000 square feet from the basement all the way up through the attic. You can get an idea what the interior looked like. This is about the 1950s, and the bottom left, you'll see the one interior shot. You see the submarine. It was like the largest artifact in the museum, and that's 14 feet in length. And if you notice, you can see that it was really based on natural history. The second floor of the museum was all minerals, and you see our former director, William Casperson, handling a specimen right there. And this is really what the museum was based on. Well, they would carve out the middle of the sections from time to time to do various exhibitions, but for the most part, we were a natural history museum until we were able to get a new facility and really become what the Paterson Museum should. The museum should focus on what makes Paterson unique. What makes us unique is being the first planned industrial city in the United States.
So on June 6, 1976, the Great Falls SUM Historic District was awarded National Historic Site designation, and that's really what leads to our moving to our current location. As a part of the efforts to rejuvenate the area around the Great Falls Development Corporation and the city of Paterson collaborated on the restoration of the Rogers Locomotive and Machine Works erecting shop building. one of the requirements for the grant funding that they received for the restoration project was the creation of, quote, a museum or cultural center on the first floor of the building. Said cultural center shall be designed to highlight and showcase the history and potential of industrial Paterson. End quote. So in 1981, Mayor Frank Graves decided to relocate the Paterson Museum onto the first floor of the erecting shop, which was simultaneously fulfilling the cultural center requirement for the grant and providing the museum much needed additional space in which to grow. The museum moved into the erecting shop in about August of 1982, and the first exhibit was hosted with an opening in April of 1983. Today, the museum has a totally different focus than it did when we were first formed, as Jack was alluding to. Our current mission is to acquire and preserve the cultural, technological, and geological history of Paterson, and to interpret Paterson's unique scientific, historic, and cultural legacy, as well as the city's contribution to our nation's history. So the museum's main gallery exhibits highlight major moments in Paterson's history. And you can see some of those here in this picture. And now that we've
So essentially, we're a general museum, not a
Yeah.
specific history museum.
Right, yes, here we go.
My favorite artifact in the museum's collections, at least when it comes to paintings. I actually have a long history with this painting that I'll go into in a minute. This is the former nail mill of Sam Colt, which was erected in 1814 and would continue in operations on the Middle Raceway, as you can see the spillway there in the right-hand side of the painting, until 1835-36. He is a direct descendant of the Sam Colt, who was born in 1814, the same time that this mill was started, that would later occupy the exact same spot for the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company. It was painted by Thomas Whitley, as you can see here. He emigrated from England and settled in Paterson initially in the early 1830s, and he was pretty much sketching and documenting the city and its industrial, landscape as it was. He actually would move over to New York City later, and he was really known for his, landscapes, especially of the Hudson River Valley as well. And he was a part of the National Academy, where he was exhibiting works of art from 1835 through 1863, and as well as a few other associations. My problem with this initially, now before we had PowerPoint, we always had slides. And when I would do my history talks, I would go through our slide bank collection, and I came across this a couple, we had 2 or 3 slides, but of course slides would wear out. And I had no idea if the painting still existed, but it was the earliest mill that I had in my collections. And one day when I had entered the Passaic County Historical Society at Lambert's Castle, I had an appointment with the director. There, the painting was hanging on the wall, and I thought, "Oh my gosh, I've been looking for this forever." And the director at the time was Susan Pamilion. She was quite excited because they had just had it recently restored, and it was clean. And it's like, "Oh, this is great." And I just asked if I could get an updated, photograph of it for my slide presentations, because mine were really faded, and I was denied permission. I said, "No, I'm not going to sell it already. I promised to acknowledge it." But she said she'd have to ask the board, and so I never got my copy of the slide. And I thought, well, I just give up on it. Years later, Heather, who was then the director of the Historical Society, attends one of our library board meetings, and going through the acquisitions go through our acquisition collections. She also were going what loans existed. And this was a loan that came from the Paterson Free Public Library. What was it, the 1930s, 1940s?
Early 30s, I think, yeah.
So I got denied to photograph a painting that belonged to us. I thought it was just so ironic, but fortunately now it's been returned. It was restored, and it's really a magnificent look at the earliest works of Paterson's industrial age. As I said, he walked throughout the city, and again, he's copying you see the bell tower there with the weather vane. The weather vane is actually in the shape of rifles. That's Sam Colt's gun mill. And actually, the painting does cause some confusion every now and then, because it's Sam Colt's nail mill, Sam Colt's gun mill, and they both are on the same location. This sketch is about 1837, because we know the building was erected between 1836 and 1837. And right there on the Middle Raceway, as you see the little bridge where the people are walking through. And we have one other view of it. as a sketch of his, looking from above by the Valley of the Rocks. This would be down along the Passaic River. So we're quite fortunate to have his sketches to, back up as, he would sketch on site and then return home and paint.
Yeah, and considering their age, they're in very good shape, these sketches, because they're basically glued. You can kind of see the residue on the scan of how they're glued to the notebook page that they're on, but they haven't had a lot of discoloration or anything as a result of the adhesive, so that's really remarkable.
As sketches, they wouldn't have been put on display either, so, it stayed in the book, put away. But you're right about the glue. Normally, the glue bleeds through terribly, so we're quite
Yeah, I mean,
fortunate on that.
there's some evidence, but not as bad as it definitely could be. So, okay. So this piece, which is entitled "A View of the Falls of the Passaic or Second River in the Province of New Jersey, sketched on the spot by His Excellency Governor Pownall," is the earliest known image of the falls to still exist. And here he is. This is English Lieutenant Governor Thomas Pownall when he visited the Great Falls during his time when he served as Lieutenant Governor of New Jersey, which was between 1755 and 1757. He produced a sketch which would go on to become the first published image of the Great Falls, which you saw a minute ago. In 1757, he became the governor of Massachusetts colony, and so he moved and held that position until 1760. In 1761, Paul Sandby printed and engraved the original sketch, or painted and engraved the original sketch, I'm sorry, which is why it's colorized. And so you can see kind of already from the fact that this was produced twice, both in color and in black and white, the Great Falls is sort of becoming this tourist destination already in the 1760s, which is really cool.
Roswell cult. Now, Alexander Hamilton does get a lot of credit for creating Paterson, but the one who really would create what Paterson would become, the industrial giant, and would redirect the entire operations of the Society for Establishing Useful Manufacturers, was this fellow here. He's known as the greatest of the cults. This portrait is painted much later in life, around 1850, and it was actually painted by a niece of his, Julia Colt Emmett. The painting actually came to us from a descendant who was looking for information about Roswell cult, and we had also passed this on to Glenn Corbett. Glenn Corbett actually did a whole talk on Roswell for us, which you can view on YouTube. Many of our artifacts have already covered some way or have some connection with our YouTube, as it's the most important people or places and things in Paterson's history. And so through the Paterson Museum Foundation, they were actually able to purchase this painting. It's still in original condition. As you can see, it's a little rough but over 100+ years, it's in really great shape, and the integrity of the portrait is great. In the future, we will restore this piece. As I mentioned, Roswell as the greatest of the cults. Next slide.
Mhm.
He's the one who really took us from becoming a national manufacturer, made the SUM brokers. He was one who redesigned the raceway system, and he would enter into agreements, leasing out the factories. So he made the biggest impact on Paterson. And he would be the governor and ran the operations from 1814, when the Colt family returned to Paterson, and would run it up until his death in 1856. And actually, the Colt family would become the governors and run the SUM either through direct lineage or through marriage until about 1899. And after that, it would only go on another 47 years before it would eventually, dissolve, and it would become part of the city of Paterson. Next. And this is the painting when we first received it. Glenn Corbett is our resident expert on Colt, as well as the president of our museum foundation, again being reviewed upon acceptance with Heather Garside, and of course next to his cousin himself, Firearms by Sam Colt, who may be the most famous in history, but the most famous one here in Paterson was Sam Colt. We're quite fortunate to have this portrait.
So the next piece is a piece of fine art, which is entitled Organic Evolution. And we selected this piece to reflect our diverse collection, which includes quite a bit of fine art, as you're sort of getting the impression, since most of the things we've presented thus far have been framed pieces. Many people think of our museum as being exclusively industrial machinery, but we do have an extensive fine art collection which reflects the many artists that have lived and worked in Paterson throughout its history. This piece was presented to the city of Paterson and Mayor Torres, and then the mayor transferred it to the museum from the city. And it's a pretty big piece. This picture doesn't really give the close. We should have done a picture of someone standing next to it. It measures 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide. And I have to admit that when I first saw it, I wasn't really in love. But I think I've decided that this piece requires a lot more attention and focus than just a fleeting glance, because there's a lot going on in it. And I think Jack and I kind of agree to disagree on this one a little bit still, but let me try and persuade everyone to my perspective. So first, and even in these photos, it's hard to convey, but there's a physical depth to the painting. There are all these dots and blobs that come out of the painting. And the depth is very irregular and inconsistent throughout the whole canvas, almost hinting to the surface of the earth. And that idea of the earth and organic material is also present in the color choices of the artist, the blues, the greens, the browns, with some white and some black as well. And then as you start to look even more closely, that is when you start to see these wonderful nods to Paterson's history, which sort of pop out at you. And they're quite subtle, which is no doubt the point and the plan of the artist, whose name was, we know as A. Boone, must have intended. For the names were painted of people and places, as well as years that are significant to Paterson, all in different orientations, all over the canvas, but they're always painted in the same color as the surface that they're on top of. So you really have to get close to the piece in order to pull out those names. And the sort of, and it's a little bit easier to see in the picture on the left how sort of the orientation is kind of all over the place with these, but some of them, when you're looking at the painting in any orientation, there are words that are upside down and sideways. So we had a really hard time sort of deciding which way we thought was up for this painting. And what we ended up deciding on was the way that we chose the orientation where the artist's title and name on the back was upright. We decided that that was probably the intended orientation of the painting. So after, I think, reflecting on this piece a lot, I think I really like it. And I think, I don't know that it's going to stay out on display after this 100 years exhibit, but and partly because it is so big, but I think it's more intriguing than originally I gave it credit for. So.
We should actually make this a contest to see if do you have a list of all the names that are on that?
We could do that in like a scavenger hunt. Yeah. I see new ones that I hadn't seen every time I look at it.
Yeah, these photographs really enhance. Like you could read Curtis Wright very easily there, dead center. It's not that easy in person.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Following in our painting theme and portraits, we have a work of art by Don Comet, who was really known throughout the city. I mean, he was a real institution, member of the Beat generation in terms of not only artwork but poetry. He was really defined as his nickname, the Count of Passaic County. Born and raised in Paterson, graduate of Central High School. You know, you'd find him just about anywhere you'd walk around in Paterson with a sketchbook in hand or writing something. He was constantly in motion, Don. Didn't walk that fast, didn't move off of a table, but constant motion. And you can see that motion even in the portrait here of Mr. Schreiner, Mr. Shiner, rather. This portrait was actually commissioned by his son when his dad passed away, and he gave Don free license to create a portrait in his style. And when he did, I think the son was not appreciative of Don's style any longer, and he rejected the painting, and he would not accept it. And it was even a question is like, why is there a pen in his pocket with the clouds? And he goes, well, maybe when he's in heaven, or whatever, he may need a pen to write something. And he was explaining how, he was going out and, and he had this whole, reasoning why behind it. I mean, it was a painting that was well thought out, but the son did not buy it either way. And so it remained in Don's collection, and he recently passed in 2022, and his estate put this together, and it's one of the pieces that they donated to the museum. Don was a constant fixture, as I mentioned, throughout Paterson. You see him in the 70s when he was part of the Silk City Poets, along with fellow poet there on the right, Joe Varilla. Joe Varilla actually is another writer, poet. Actually, it's his photography exhibit of Joe, but this is about Don. And these two were actually inseparable at times, and they could do like a two-man show. As I mentioned, Don was really, I guess a real Renaissance man when it came to, his attitudes of life and his understanding of it. And I mean, he really did have a deep appreciation for being alive in the environment that he was in, and especially his love of people.
And we should mention too that he was one of the artists that lived in the artist housing just down the street from us.
He was one of the very first to be in there.
Okay.
Remained there his rest until he passed. This is him much later in life, probably about a year before he transitioned himself. And this is at the a workshop that was held by the Word Seed that has an annual has monthly rather poetry exhibits and discussions here. While Don was here, he was writing poetry and including sketches. His poetry was also the motion in his writing. And one last one. There we have hundreds of these sketchbooks. There's actually, I think, 1,600 that have been preserved, and there's probably about another 1,000 that were not saved over the years. As I said, Don was constantly sketching, drawing. He also did collage. He would pick up when we were going through one of the books I found, he had one or two of our old former show postcards pasted in there and then worked it into a piece of artwork. So
I think the one on the right in particular, you can see how he integrated drawing with words, and that's very similar to some of the stuff that he produced during those poetry workshops. Because I think he attended at least 2 poetry workshops here, which is when I really got to know him better. But it was interesting how particularly, and these examples aren't even necessarily the best of that, but how sometimes you're looking at his piece and then all of a sudden these words start popping out at you. It's very, interesting how he kind of interwove
later
those
stuff's
together.
harder to read. And I also wanted to say about, how diverse he was, for a living. He was also a teacher, taught at Passaic County Community College. He was also a substitute teacher for the Paterson Public School System. And where I would always catch him is not that I saw him at the site, but he'd come back. He was also a caddy at the North Jersey Country Club. So he was really diverse. Our Larry Doby jersey. Uh, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Larry Doby crossing the color barrier, we had reached out to Doby, and actually the curator of that show was Joe Varilla. We had met Doby at his home. We are getting ready for our July 5th, 1997 50th anniversary, and Doby was very cordial to invite us, gave us some of the stories which we would use in the exhibit, and he was able to donate one of the jerseys that was presented to him that you see right here. And this is the jersey signaling 1948. That's a year after he broke the color barrier. Of course, today they're no longer called the Indians or the Cleveland Guardians.
And 48 is significant because that's when they won the World Series, correct?
What's unique about Doby is that he holds the distinction that no one else will have. In 1946, while playing for the Newark Eagles, they won the Colored World Series, and he hit a home run in that World Series. And in 1948, he would win the World Series as well as hit a home run for the Cleveland Indians. For the Cleveland Indians themselves, they've only won the World Series twice, as an aside, 1920 and 1948. And both times they had an outfielder from Paterson. In 1920, it was Chuck Jameson. And in 1948, it was our own Larry Doby, who was also Eastside High School's first 4-letter man. He varsityed in basketball, football, track and field, and basketball, football, track and field. What am I missing?
Baseball.
Oh, baseball. Yeah, I couldn't figure that one. Thank you, Heather. I'm just saying if you're paying attention. This is Doby when they retired his number in '97 at Cleveland Stadium. And you can see this jersey as well. It's on display at the Muth Museum and the Hinchliffe Stadium.
So the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures was founded in November of 1791, and they established Paterson as a location for the development of our new nation's first industry. Many people talk about Paterson's early history as the birthplace of American industry, which is true. But however, it's important to know that it's not quite as amazing and shiny in its early stages as it sometimes sounds in the textbooks. It's really important to acknowledge that the experiment that became Paterson, New Jersey, was not a guaranteed success. The early history of the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures is full of failures and bad outcomes. At a meeting on, and these lottery tickets, which you see before you, are one of perfect examples of those early failures. At a meeting in January 21st, 1792, a committee was formed to explore the option of raising money within the SUM through a lottery. The lottery was proposed as a way to raise some quick cash, and the company sold the lottery tickets at a significantly lower cost than the purchase of company shares. So basically, they're trying to get probably lower income people to sort of be able to join the company without being able to having to have the full capital in order to buy the shares. Each ticket reads Paterson Lottery. This ticket will entitle the bearer to such prize as the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures erected by virtue of an act of legislature of the state of New Jersey, subject to the deduction of 15%. If the lottery had been successful, it would have raised $100,000, which is roughly $3 million today. But not enough people bought into the scheme, and the whole attempt was a big flop. Now, they were talking about it in January. By April of 1792, the idea of the lottery had been completely abandoned. However, they do attempt a second lottery in 1793. The second attempt is not only just as much of a failure, but probably worse, because instead of resulting in the needed fund boost that they were hoping to find for the corporation, they actually lost money on that second lottery. So the SUM would continue to struggle financially until Roswell Colt, who Jack introduced you to earlier, took over governorship in 1814, and that's really when things start to get a little bit better for the society.
What's interesting about these lottery tickets, back in 1990, when I was at the Smithsonian on taking a seminar, and I was walking through the American history wing of the Smithsonian, the first time I saw anything mention Paterson, New Jersey, it was under early paper making, and what they had as an example were these lottery tickets.
We have these are framed, and then we have a couple of other examples on our collection of separate individual tickets as well. So Mayor Lawrence Pat Kramer is easily one of the most influential Paterson mayors of the late 20th century. And as such, we felt that he deserved a place in this exhibit. And so we put this framed collage up in honor of Pat. And this is especially true because our current home is one of the buildings preserved as a part of the historic preservation wave that was created during his administration. He served 2 terms as mayor. The first began in 1967, and then he returned in 1975 and served for a term then. Kramer's administration saw the beginning of historic preservation to Paterson's industrial landscape. And during his time in office, the Great Falls, as I mentioned earlier, was declared a national natural landmark, and the Great Falls Historic District was designated. And during in 1971, the Great Falls Festival was created during his administration as well to draw attention to this amazing location. It was during his second term in office that the Great Falls was declared a national historical landmark by President Ford, and that's in 1976. And that was a major step towards creating the national park that we have today. Now, many of us, including myself, had a chance to know Pat. I got to know Pat much later in life. He was still a very active supporter of Paterson and the national park right up until his passing in 2023. At the museum, he continued to help us by serving as a member of the Paterson Museum Foundation Board and showed up to support our events and initiatives. And every time Pat joined a meeting, it was really, really nice. He was such a great, he was such a good cheerleader. He was very good about making you feel like you were doing the best you could do. He used to always end sort of his goodbye sign off would be something to the effect of like, you're all wonderful and you're doing amazing work. Keep it up. It was always a great pat on the back. We're very lucky that Pat was interviewed by the National Parks Oral History Project, and that interview can be read on the Paterson Great Falls National Historical Parks website. And he was also recorded in conversation with late Passaic County historian Ed Smike, and that video is available on the Paterson Museum's YouTube channel. So even though Pat has left us, we still have a little bit of him here.
Okay, as the city by the falls, everyone knows the Great Falls is the main symbol of the city of Paterson. Of course, as you are entering the city, as you're driving into almost every bridge, when you get into town, the first thing you'll see, of course, is your welcome to Paterson. And what was chosen to welcome to Paterson is the Great Falls. And that was the real purpose of selecting this sign. I have to say, this was the first thing that got negative comments regularly because of the mayor's name. Actually, to the point where some people are saying you should scratch that out. And it's like, we're not here to change history or make a comment on it. We're here to preserve history. And that's what this happens to be about. But the focus on the focus on the mayor's name was not the point of the selection. It's the sign. So keep that in mind.
And the sign looks the same. It's just got new mayor's names, the ones that are hanging up now. Look, yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of signs, number 10 on our list is actually two artifacts. And these are both street signs, the Reverend Dr. Albert Prince Row Square street sign and the Luke Costello Place street sign. While these were both selected in part to celebrate the accomplishments of these two amazing Patersonians, one a civil rights activist, the other a stage and screen star, these signs were also selected to be representative of the way that the museum and the city of Paterson, in a larger sense, commemorate and celebrate our history. As you drive around Paterson, you'll notice that many streets have been renamed to celebrate individuals or groups that make up our city's diverse story. Some of the areas include Peru Square and Bangladeshi Way, and they celebrate ethnic diversity, while other signs, such as Blackstreet Boulevard and Mayor Lawrence Pat Kramer Way, commemorate the success and accomplishments of individual Patersonians. So many of the artifacts in this exhibit have been a part of the museum's collection for many, many years. However, this piece, I'm proud to say, I personally collected for the museum in 2021. And that's really also a very important point to make about the museum. While we're actively collecting older artifacts to improve and grow our collection, as a curator, it's also a part of my job to be actively acquiring artifacts related to our history in real time. And I feel like in many cases, museums of the past have sort of been so focused on 30, 40 years ago that they forgot about the history that was being made with them right then in real time. So as a part of that, I'm always looking for modern photos, giveaways from businesses, politicians, election posters, ads from local businesses, programs from city events. And of course, one of those items was this lovely poster, which was developed by our neighbor, the New Jersey Community Development Corporation, the NJCDC, to commemorate the 10th anniversary of Paterson Great Falls National Historical Park being formed. So this, as I said, took place in 2021. And here's some pictures of the event at the Great Falls, where we were celebrating with birthday cake. The NJCDC, which celebrated its own 30th anniversary in 2024, is an amazing partner to have in the historic district. Their organization, with the leadership of founder and CEO Bob Garside, has restored a number of historic buildings on Spruce Street, helping to make the corridor more attractive and appealing to visitors and residents alike. They have also created several commemorative posters to recognize important moments in Paterson's history, the most recent being the poster to celebrate the reopening of Hinchliffe Stadium, which we also have in our collection.
Talk about collecting things yourself. Although 35 years have gone by since I picked up this poster. Mayor Frank Graves, the omnipresent mayor. No matter where you were, you could feel his presence. When he walked into a room, the place lit up. You know, Frank Graves was twice mayor. He was mayor from 61 to 66 and 1980 and to 1990. I collected this poster when I was called to the mayor's office. I was fortunate that, I'm a division director. Department directors, I think, reported to Frank every single day in his office. But once in a while, I would get my call in, and because he wanted to know what everybody was doing, and it was most important, you were representing him, and he allowed you to do that. So Frank was quite the guy, but he really loved and cared about his city. This was his poster that was coming for the 1990 election, his reelection campaign. And when I was in the office, they had just delivered them from the printer. So they were in their wrappers and they were open. They inspected them. And a couple of people were like, "Oh, should we start getting these out, Mayor, and to the public?" And he's like, "It's too early." He goes, "First of all, he goes, how do you know I'm even going to be around?" No words were ever truer, because on March 4th, probably about a month or so after, I was in his office, he had passed while he was in office. So those posters were never used. But after you're doing the transition with mayor, we were invited to clean out some of the artifacts that we may want. I noticed those couple of bundles, and I took one bundle of a campaign that was never to be. Again, Frank was everywhere. Here's his very first, run as mayor, as the handsome, dashing man that he thinks he was. Again, he was really the reactionary mayor. But anyone could get on the phone. If you called up, if a tree fell down, you'd get through the mayor's office. He'd have DPW there, and that tree would be gone. Loved the police department. Loved public safety. He believed that was the main function of city government. However, he did not forget about other agencies, especially the museum. I was fortunate that actually Frank appointed me back in April 14th, 1989. The museum had just undergone a fire a few months earlier, and then acting director Barbara Volta had left, and I was appointed by Frank. And he did mean, when he made a statement, he says, "I want to stop treating it, the museum," as referring to, as a stepchild or as an orphan. Anytime I needed something for the museum, he granted it. And when I started having exhibitions, he was the first one there to say a few words or just check up on me, make sure I was doing the job that he expected for the citizens of Paterson. Okay, next, the map. 1840. Actually, this map of Paterson is from May 1st, 1840. It's actually the second oldest map in our collections. It was actually drawn by C. Van Wagner, excuse me, civil engineer, and was printed in New York City. What's most important about this isn't the actual depiction of the street and layouts, but the legend that you see right in the middle of the two portraits there is the legend indicates the factories, churches, and hotels. And particularly with the factories, it's most important because it not only gives you the factory name and location, but it also said what they were involved in, whether it was leather goods, machine works, or cotton. So, it gives us a little insight to what's going on off of the raceway system. And really, the raceway system is what powered everything from 1794 to 1859. So you won't find any industries that require power outside of the immediate area of the Great Falls. We're really quite fortunate to have this map. I hope one day to send it out for restoration. It does have some water damage, which is somewhat extensive, but it doesn't really interfere with the main viewing area that we require. And if it can be retouched through Photoshop and all, we'll be able to, resurrect its beauty fully and display. Normally, we don't display the original, so here's your chance to come and see it while it's on display for the rest of the year.
So another example of our visual arts in the museum's collection is this piece, which is Gasworks, Paterson, New Jersey, painted by Otto Benz. Benz was born in Paterson in 1882, and he worked in Paterson for many years as a textile designer. Later in life, he moved to Haledon and eventually North Haledon. He didn't begin painting until his retirement, but his artistry quickly became apparent. He exhibited both locally in places like Montclair and the Paper Mill Playhouse, as well as having an exhibition in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. According to his obituary, he was considered an authority on botany, mineralogy, and horticulture. But what is important to us, particularly at the museum, from a historical perspective, is he was preserving local urban landscapes in his paintings of Paterson and the surrounding communities. He was recognized for his contributions to the culture of northern New Jersey during his own lifetime. In 1960, he was honored with a testimonial dinner at which the guest speaker was Gaetano Federici, Paterson's own famous sculptor. Benz passed away in 1962 at 80 years old and is buried in Laurel Grove Cemetery in Totowa. The flood meter. One of Paterson's greatest assets is the Passaic River. However, the river brings with it many challenges. The Passaic River floods at least once a year, often more frequently than that, depending on rainfall. And there have been many historic flood years in the city's history. 1854, 1882, February 1902, and the so-called Great Flood of October 1903, when the river crested at 17.5 feet. Since the 1960s, flooding and damage along the Passaic River has been declared a federal disaster on 14 occasions. The picture on the bottom right shows a flood meter in action on River Street during the most recent flooding in January of 2024. Two of the most recent of the 14 federal declarations were Hurricane Irene in 2011 and Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which both resulted in catastrophic flooding in the city. However, following Hurricane Irene, parts of the city struggled with flooding for a week later, and President Obama and Governor Christie visited the city in early September to review the damage. But one interesting and somewhat unexpected result of the flooding that took place in Paterson following Hurricane Irene was that the raceways were used to divert some of the floodwaters from the river. And this is the first time anyone's seen water running in the raceways, at least at this volume, in a very long time. Luckily for us, Jack had the forethought to photograph the occasion. And so we can now more easily imagine what it would be like to have water in the raceway system once again because of these pictures.
I did that on my lunch hour, and Libby's was not open. Bridge topper. Actually, this is one of my favorite pieces in the museum. It's cast iron, and it must weigh somewhere between 350 and 400 pounds. We've had it for quite a few years, and I could never figure out how to get it on display, but I knew in the future we would. Well, this prompted me to get it on display. As you can see, it was this is the old Spruce Street Bridge, the very first bridge that would cross the Passaic River, and it was erected in 1870. Got a shot of it. These are the details. You can see it's the bridge topper, and here's the bridge. And we assume these are the freeholders, as this was the board that finances it. So it's a county bridge actually. Passaic County was formed in 1837 itself. Before that, we're part of Bergen and Essex County. So this is the old Spruce Street Bridge, and you can see its location right there. Paterson Museum, if you follow down the bridge, would be on the left-hand side, right in this area, just below center. This is from the 1877 City Atlas. Now, we believe the bridge to be built in Paterson, and here's a very similar one. Actually, it's almost identical, but for the decorative elements that support it, on the previous bridge has 28 floral pieces. This one has 32, so it's slightly wider, but the bridge topper is exact. And when you zoom in on this particular cabinet card, you could read that it was from the Watson Machine Company. Watson Machine Company was in Paterson for over 150 years. This is the Main Street Bridge back in about 1871, and you can see where it crosses. The West Bridge would be West Broadway Bridge, just to give you, your bearings.
The Morning Call sign. So the Morning Call, or the Paterson Morning Call, was a newspaper founded by this gentleman, Edward B. Haynes. He was born in New Orleans, and he spent much of his life traveling around the United States working for various newspapers. And sometimes only for 6 months or a year before he completely picked up and moved to states. In July of 1885, when he was living and working in Pennsylvania, he visited Paterson and saw an opportunity. He returned a few months later and founded the Morning Call, printing the first issue on October 1st, 1885. And here is the first issue itself. The Call was printed from Monday to Saturday, with a special Sunday call being printed on Sundays, and it sold for 2 cents. And it became the city's first morning newspaper. So in this period, in big cities, they would have morning news, and then they would have evening news. And so that way, if you look at, if you're comparing the papers for something like a special event, it'll be talking about who's going to speak at the, opening or groundbreaking or whatever. And then you'll have the actual account of what did happen that evening. Haynes operated the paper through 1888, so only for about 3 years, and then he sold the paper to the Call Printing and Publishing Company in 1889, and he left the city. The Call Printing and Publishing Company published their first issue of the Morning Call on January 28th, 1889. I think they ended up skipping a week or two between ownerships, and they operated the paper until 1969. This is the Morning Call building, which was located at 35 Church Street. Now, Haynes actually would return to Paterson within a year. It was his one of his few business ventures where he left the newspaper business. I think he was trying to build furniture. Didn't work. So he comes back to Paterson and he founds the News Printing Company. And that company begins printing the Paterson Evening News in 1890. And eventually the Bergen Record would absorb, right, Jack? The Bergen Record absorbs all of these papers.
Yeah. Yes, correct. North Jersey newspapers, right?
Yeah.
Not to go back, but actually one point I forgot as I'm sitting here listening and thinking the same time, Heather, about the bridge. The one thing also significant to another piece of in our collection I mentioned earlier, the Holland 1 submarine. The Holland 1 submarine remained about 50 years underwater in the Passaic River, right adjacent to that bridge. And when they replaced that bridge in 1932, they actually put a dedicated plaque reminding people that, this was the site where John Holland tested his first successful submarine. And that was done at the insistence of the time at a Captain Frank Bott of the Paterson Police Department, who actually sort of acted as the manager for the 8 college students or young men that actually found the submarine and presented it to the city in October of 27. So I just wanted to get that little detail in. You didn't need the slide back. Now, for one of our most famous pieces of furniture in the museum, we have a New Jersey Senate desk. This desk goes back to 1905, and it was presented to Senator Anthony Grossi in 1966. At the time, they did a reapportionment of the state rather, and they needed 8 new senators to move in. And so they decided this was the time to renovate the Senate chambers in Trenton, and desks went everywhere. Some were destroyed, some remained, and Senator Grossi was given his, and he was going to go to his house when the museum director, Phil Del Vecchio, and I have to say, Phil Del Vecchio was more tied in with the science and nature than the history, but he saw this as a very important piece. Back and forth, I got to mention Phil Del Vecchio. Phil Del Vecchio, I think, was in his 90s when I was appointed the director. And he would call me at least once a week to find out how I was doing and was there anything he could do for me. And I thought that was really sweet of him. He lived on East 24th Street. But yeah, the very first person from the museum's past to contact me was Phil, and he was very active with the Nature Center and most importantly, astronomy and seismology with the, you could see it there at the Rifle Camp Park. Anyway, as for the desk, what's more important about this, we created a little corner for Senator Grossi. We also have the chair and a Senate clock. But again, we received this because they remodeled the Senate in 66. In around 88 or so, they decided they're going to renovate again the Senate. And then they were looking for one of the desks because they wanted to recreate the Senate as it once was. And so the architectural firm from Princeton, which was Ford, Farewell, Mills, and Gatch, they needed a desk, and they borrowed our desk. So we gave them that desk, and then it was on display. I have to say, it took me 10 years to get the desk back from the New Jersey Senate. They didn't want to give it back. And who did help us, I just give a personal story. Mrs. Littell, you had Senator Littell from Sussex County. I happened to be at Edison Antiques, which is a business they once owned, and she'd always ask me how things are going in Paterson and want to know what's going on. And she knew everybody, as she was once head of the Republican committee for the state. Anyway, I told her, yeah, the state was giving me a problem. This is on a Sunday, mind you, after I went to church. It's around 1 o'clock. And I mentioned, yeah, I can't get the desk back. They said it was on display. Now it's in storage. They don't know where it is. And I wasn't even complaining. I just mentioned that to her. When I came in Monday morning, there's a New Jersey State delivery truck, and we were used to that because DIFUS used to be located in the building. So I figured they're just getting their paper shipments or whatever. And lo and behold, what's coming off at 9 o'clock in the morning was our Senate desk. So Mrs. Littell had some power, but that's how we're able to return it to the museum. It was always ours, but getting it back was not easy. The recreated Senate. Lovely, lovely restoration to bring it back to its former glory. And you'll notice the detail on the desk. It's completely modeled after the original 1905 desk that Senator Grossi presented to us. The SUM Minute Book. This is the minutes of the board of directors. The very first entry is November 22nd, 1791, when they received their charter. They're the first private corporation chartered in the state of New Jersey. And this is the minute book from roughly 1791 to about 1845. There's also volume 2. We have both of them. And we also have actually quite a few pieces of correspondence, leases, deeds. So we have a great core collection of the early activities up through their when they dissolved in 1946. Now, I've reviewed this book more than once. And I kept trying to establish that Alexander Hamilton was definitely here July 4th, 1792, when they decided where they were going to fix the seat of manufacturing and the town of Paterson to be named in honor of Governor William Paterson. And I looked through the July 3rd, 4th, 5th, because they were here for these few days at Abraham Godwin's Hotel, and I didn't see it. It's actually open to the page right here. And I did read, who was in attendance, and it says the Secretary of the Treasury. And I just assume it's the Secretary of the Treasurer of the Society, not thinking the Secretary of the Treasury. They don't recognize Alexander Hamilton as his name, but by his, official federal title. Although on the next page, it will talk about Hamilton and his plan and what they were going to do for manufacturing. So we're quite fortunate to have this. The book, as you can see it now, was restored by us. It's actually to the tune of, we received a grant to have Northeast Document conserve the book. So they deacidified the pages, encapsulated, they separated the bindings and put them in mylar, so they could also be either removed individually or they'll lay flat with any more tension to the books. It actually cost about $15,000 to preserve this book and several others, including book number 2 and some of the loose documents.
And when was that, Jack?
That was done in the mid-90s.
Yeah, because I think it would cost a bit more than that now.
Yeah. But they did it. Yeah, fantastic job. The book has been, it was microfilmed once, but really it needs to go on to the next phase to get it scanned. And so we can, get this open to more scholars.
Yeah. And last but not least, we arrive at number 20, which is, I must admit, one of my personal favorites. So this is actually a letter to Mrs. Hobart from Liberty National Bank. And I'm going to just read it to you first. It's a letter of sympathy to Mrs. Hobart following the recent loss of her husband, Vice President Garrett Hobart. The first page, which is the front, reads, Mrs. Garrett A. Hobart, Carroll Hall, Paterson, New Jersey. Dear Madam, at a meeting of the Board of Directors of the Liberty National Bank held Thursday, December 7th, 1899, the following minute was adopted. On the morning of November 21st, 1899, occurred the death of Garrett Augustus Hobart, Vice President of the United States and a member of this board. And then we flip it over to the back, and it continues. Mr. Hobart has been associated with this bank as a director since its organization. By the noble qualities of his nature, preeminently his modesty, unselfishness, and genial human sympathy, he endeared himself to everyone associated with him, and a deep sense of personal loss is felt by each member of this board. By virtue of eminent ability, sagacity, and loyal patriotism, Vice President Hobart is mourned not only by his friends, but by the nation. And it's signed Henry P. Davison, Secretary. Now here we have Mr. and Mrs. Hobart a little bit later on in their life. Garrett trained as a lawyer under Jenny's father, Socrates Tuttle, in Paterson, and then he married Jenny Tuttle Hobart in 1869. While working as a lawyer, Garrett was involved in many different boards and businesses, serving, and this is just to name a couple, as manager of the East Jersey Waterworks System, president of the Savings Institution. He was involved with the People's Gas Company. He was director of the Barber Flax Spinning Company. He was director of the Pioneer Silk Company. And as we heard in this letter, he was a founding member of the Liberty National Bank. He was also he dabbled in politics a little bit, which he always claimed was his hobby and not his profession, and served in several important capacities, including as state senator for New Jersey. In 1896, he was selected as a running mate to presidential hopeful William McKinley, and they were successful in their campaign. They were elected, and he became the 24th vice president of the United States. And here they are together. And the letter that I read from the Liberty National Bank is actually only one of several condolence letters that we have in our collection related to the death of Vice President Hobart's demise. And here's just two more examples of letters that were written. These are actually written to the nation rather than to Mrs. Hobart specifically. The one that we read has a much more personal nature to it. And
So he married the boss. I always think of him as he married the boss's daughter, and he did well. And he was actually the first effective vice president. It seems like for most people, you sort of give up public office when you become the vice president. He effectively managed the nation with him, with McKinley, that is. And in tribute to that, when he passed, the office was left vacant until the next election, and that's where Theodore Roosevelt would come to rise.
Yes, he actually didn't pass much before the re-election anyway, I don't think. But one of the things that Jenny Tuttle Hobart wrote in her memoir was that when he took on the office of vice president, it was considered at that time to be the fifth wheel on the wagon. And he actually is the one who comes along and kind of creates a role for the vice president as sort of a go-between between Congress and the president. And sort of formed the role in its more modern approach. So we have now reached the end of our 20 items, and this is the time for us to answer questions if anybody has anything. So the first question is from Eve. She said, I believe that you said that this is the order in which the visitor to the museum would encounter these artifacts. Is there a strategy to the ordering? Well, there is and there isn't. We chose not to go in a particularly chronological order, and that was both for the sort of the fun of it and also for practical purposes. Some of the artifacts, none of these that we've presented as the first 20, but as we get going into deeper into the 100 artifacts, some of them are too big to move and parts of our permanent exhibits. So their number is based on just where they sort of fall within the museum. But we did sort of think about how, when we were putting the exhibit together, how to put things in such a way that we were trying to sort of demonstrate the diversity of our collection. So, both in time periods and types of material and, and so that was part of why we designed it in such a way that you kind of are jumping around a lot.
That's why the first few artifacts that you've seen here are pretty much flat work, because we don't have many real walls in here, and the main walls are on the Hannah Gallery.
Right. So pretty much you haven't left the Hannah Gallery yet if we were doing this in real person. So Dennis has said that he's enjoyed the diversity of the artifacts and thanks for the presentation. Mike says thanks for the presentation. We do have one question though, Jack. Someone's asking us if there are any things that didn't make the cut of 100 artifacts. It was a very difficult process where Jack and I kind of created our own lists, neither of which got to a full 100, but we really kind of resented that the other person thought we could only pick 20. There was a lot of debate going back and forth, right?
Yeah, well, there were quite a few things that were worthy, some of them large, some of them small. Some of my favorite things, actually, we have this beautiful brass what do you call it, end counter, which you would put over fabric and you would count how many, warp ends were in there. It's a lovely little piece. But it didn't get, we have a twist counter, didn't get put in, certain things for the textile industry, we're used to the looms, but there are actually some very, precise instruments for measuring that are, They look very scientific, and they are, but couldn't show everything. You have these big, you got the textile industry that'll take care of itself. Um, yeah, there's quite a few exhibits. If we would have had problems if we would have narrowed it down to the 1,000 items.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is that we have very different sort of senses of what's cool or what's important. And definitely this was an exhibit where we were able to say, no, I want this one in because I like it and think it's significant. And this is how I can justify it, which I feel like with a normal exhibit is a little harder to do. All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. We look forward to seeing some of you again on June 3rd and June 18th for the second part in this series. And until then, have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.